Hello, everybody. I'm Georgia Diabo, and in this screencast, I will discuss how multilinguals acquire tense and aspect. This material has been jointly prepared by myself and Irene Conta at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. First, I will present tense and aspect distinctions and provide some examples from various languages, illustrating how they are encoded. Then I will refer to the acquisition of tense and aspect in monolingual and multilingual speakers. Finally, I will discuss some proposals that explain the difficulties faced in acquisition, and I will close with some suggestions that can be applied when teaching multilingual classes. In this slide, we can see timelines that depict some basic distinctions between tense on one hand and grammatical and lexical aspect on the other. Tense anchors the event or situation in time and locates it in a specific time point in relation to now, the speech event. So, if we imagine time as a line, now is the moment of speaking and refers to present time. Past and future are positioned prior or after present time. Tense is morphologically marked across languages. Grammatical or viewpoint aspect specifies the internal temporal constituency of a situation. That is, aspect does not relate the time of reference to some other time, but it conveys other temporal information, such as the duration, as in the case of the event E1, during the time interval which lasts from T1 to T2, or completion and frequency, as in E2, 3, and 4, which illustrate repetitive events. Aspect is also morphologically marked across languages. Finally, lexical or inherent aspect resides in the semantics of verbs and their arguments and is not morphologically marked. Next, we examine each of these distinctions in more detail. In English, for example, adding the morpheme ed to the verb walk to form walked indicates that the event denoted by the verb occurred before the present time in the past. However, things are not always that simple. Let's read some examples. We first read, my train leaves tomorrow morning. We immediately understand that present tense does not necessarily relate to present time. Next, we read, Maya walked to the park. Maya was walking to the park. Maya was walking to the park when the earthquake hit. All these examples refer to past events, but morphological marking differs. Noticeably, in the last example, the different forms used help the reader or listener locate these events in the same referent time, that is, perceive them as simultaneous. Finally, although in Tom will have reached the place by now, will, should mark something that takes place in the future, the use of now helps us understand that the reference point specified is not a future one. Temporal morphemes locate these eventualities in time. Of course, this does not mean that languages that lack such morphemes as Mandarin Chinese are not able to express temporal relations. They just choose other means to do it. From a typological view, we also observe that most languages distinguish between past and non-past, while few other between future and non-future. As already said, aspect deals with the internal constituency of actions, events, states, processes, or situations. Languages usually distinguish between perfective and imperfective aspect. Essentially, the perfective aspect, the yellow rectangular in the shape, looks at an event as a complete action. It indicates the view of a situation as a single whole without distinction of the various separate phases that make up that situation. The imperfective aspect, the blue dotted line in the shape, pays essential attention to the internal structure of the situation. It views the event from within while it unfolds, or sees it as a process of a repeated or habitual event, thus corresponding to the progressive, continuous aspect for events of short-term duration and to habitual aspect for longer terms. Different languages make different grammatical aspectual distinctions. For example, in Romance, Slavic, and Greek, the morphology for imperfective aspect expresses progressivity and also habituality. As we see in the paradigm, Imperfective verb forms are used to denote both what the subject was doing and what he or she used to do. This syncretism does not exist in other languages, as is the case of Hindi. Notice that the examples refer to past actions. Cross-linguistic differences can be observed in all the tenses that perfective or imperfective aspect morphology is expressed. Let's outline some cross-linguistic differences. Greek is a language that encodes the distinction between the perfective and the imperfective in the past, future, subjunctive, and the imperative. Imperfective forms are used also to encode progressivity and habituality, while perfective ones express also repetition. Romance languages encode the distinction between perfective and imperfective in the past, as is the distinction between passé composé and imparfait. Certain Romance languages, as Italian and Spanish, also encode progressivity. English encodes the distinction between the perfective, simple past, I walked, and the progressive, as in past progressive, I was walking, while other Germanic languages, like German and Dutch, do not morphologically encode grammatical aspect. That is, these languages lack the grammatical means to express an aspectual difference via alternative forms and leave it to the context whether an accomplishment expresses a complete or incomplete event. These observations take us to consider what lexical aspect stands for. Sis Wendler in 1967, who worked on the basis of earlier work by philosophers such as Kenny or Aristotle, linguists distinguish at least 4 aspectual classes. These are states like know, activities like run, accomplishments like cross the street, and achievements like recognize. In addition, linguists often assume that verbs like flash or sneeze form an extra class, the class of semelfactis or points, which was introduced by Comrie. These categories are distinguished from one another in terms of semantic features as boundedness and in terms of the grammatical effects they downstream. To name a few, states are durative and involve no change. Accomplishments describe the internal temporal constituency of a situation in a more detailed way than activities. For example, crossing the street includes the starting point of the activity, which goes on for some time and involves a result state, that is, be on the other side of the street. It is thus classified as accomplishment. Activities do not have a terminal point, so there is no need to elaborate descriptions for these activities or achievements. We also said that there are grammatical means of distinguishing between these aspectual classes. For example, states and achievements cannot occur with a progressive, expressed with imperfective aspect, while activities and accomplishments can. The discussions so far shows that the acquisition of tense and aspect is a very puzzling task. The rate of monolingual acquisition depends on the language being acquired. It seems to be fairly quick in certain languages, for example, until the age of 4 in Spanish, whereas it takes much more time in other languages, for example, until the age of 6 or 7 for Greek. Many recent research on bilingualism has also revealed that tense and aspect morphology can be particularly difficult for bilingual children. Thus, the acquisition of tense and aspect is of particular relevance to teachers. If we want to mention some examples that illustrate the order of acquisition, we need to first consider that monolingual, bilingual, and second language acquisition present more or less the same pattern in the order of occurrence of the various verb types. Importantly, new forms are initially not functional for encoding the tense aspect distinction. In other words, even if morphologically correct, they are still ungrammatical when examined in relation to the context. Of course, there is a variation according to the specific characteristic of each language. Take, for example, English. Children first produce bare verbs. The first formal categories to emerge are verbs in ing, initially without an auxiliary, or with an analyzed auxiliary as playing. irregular past forms, especially was and had. Then they produce past forms in ed, like played. Then we find occurrences as is going, married, are go, dancing, followed by analytic perfect-like forms like have, see, is, fall, and has, fall. In the end, we get grammatical verb forms like goes, comes for the present tense, and will make, will see for the future. Overall, it seems that there is the following universal trends. First, present tense is acquired. Next, simple past tense forms, that is perfective aspect forms, followed by present perfect and finally future. Noticeably, present perfect denotes a past time event that is related to present time and is thus semantically more complex. Futurity, on the other hand, encompasses modality, that is intention, desire, possibility, etc., and is thus acquired later. When the language acquired uses auxiliaries, at the initial stages, they are usually omitted, as illustrates the example from English dad walking. Besides, we often observe that children produce correctly frequent irregular forms before regular ones, while in general, they continue to struggle with irregularity for a very long period. In both L1 and L2 acquisition, it has been observed that there is a strong connection between lexical aspect of verbs and tense aspect morphology. First, children use past marking or perfective marking for languages like Chinese or Spanish on achievement and accomplishment verbs. Eventually, they extend its use to activity and stative verbs. In languages that encode the perfective-imperfective distinction, imperfective past appears later than the perfective, and imperfective past marking begins with stative verbs and activity verbs. Then it extends to accomplishment and achievement verbs. In languages that have progressive aspect, progressive marking begins with activity verbs. Then it extends to accomplishment or achievement verbs, while no incorrect overextension of progressive is observed for stative verbs. Finally, cross-linguistic research gives controversial results with regards to the acquisition of the habitual and the progressive. In some languages, as in Italian and French, habitual appears before progressive, while in others, like Greek, progressive is correctly used before habitual. An early account of the defective tense hypothesis suggested that aspect comes before tense because researchers observed that monolingual children are initially unable to express tense relations, whereas they can express aspect. They based this proposal on evidence from the fact that they use the present instead of the imperfective in past contexts. This has been considered too strong a claim and could not be verified for bilingual acquisition. Next, the aspect hypothesis better accommodates grammatical productions as it proposes the effect of congruency in meaning between grammatical and lexical aspect. For example, the verbs that denote achievements and the past perfective forms share common prototypical features as they are telic, punctual, and dynamic. Thus, they are acquired early. Findings are controversial, as some studies support the aspect hypothesis, while others show that it holds mostly for the perfective and not for the imperfective aspect. In case of impoverished input, bilingual children may never extend the use of the perfective to stative verbs or the use of the imperfective to achievements and accomplishments. Interestingly, research on bilingual acquisition revealed cross-linguistic influence in that there can be interference when the other language encodes different aspectual distinctions, and there may be a facilitatory effect when the other language lacks morphological aspect. The role of input is thus considered very important, and it is mostly associated with problems with the imperfective aspect, as the perfective is acquired earlier and has been considered as a default in the past by many researchers. Before closing, let's consider what we can do to help children when teaching in multilingual classes. First, Give your children minimal pairs of situations that focus on the difference between the viewpoint aspects used. Focus on form and raising of metalinguistic awareness have been proved effective with research-based evidence. Next, explore the different realizations of tense and aspect in their other languages to better illustrate connection between lexical aspect and tense aspect morphology in the target language. Translanguaging and comparative analysis of the language systems of the class can help children benefit from their rich language repertoires. But most importantly, be patient. The acquisition of verb morphology takes time. All in all, in this screencast, I first discussed important notions that help us understand the tense and aspect distinctions, and I next presented some cross-linguistic evidence. Then I referred to proposals that explain the difficulties faced in acquisition, and I closed with some suggestions that may facilitate tense and aspect acquisition among multilingual speakers.